The cold wind cut across the wheat fields of Verdania, seven like a knife. Jake Bennett pulled his jacket tighter as he checked the greenhouse locks one last time. The sun had already dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange that never stopped feeling alien, even after 3 years on this rock. 3 years. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime. Sometimes it felt like yesterday when he packed up everything and left Earth behind, running from memories that hurt too much to face. His little farm here was quiet. Too quiet. Back home there had always been noise, music playing in the kitchen, voices calling from the fields, life everywhere. Now there was just the wind and the crops and the endless silence that pressed down on him like a weight. He wiped dirt from his hands and started the walk back to his cabin. His boots crunched on the gravel path. The twin moons were rising, casting double shadows across the ground. Jake had almost reached his porch when he heard it. A screech. High-pitched and desperate. Coming from the storage barn. Jake froze. That sound, it wasn't any animal he knew. It was terrified, whatever it was. His heart kicked into overdrive. He spun around and ran for the porch, grabbing his plasma rifle from where it leaned against the wall. His hands moved on autopilot, checking the charge, flicking off the safety. 3 years alone on a frontier world had taught him to be ready for trouble. The barn door was wide open, swaying in the wind. That was wrong. He'd locked it that morning. Jake slowed his approach, rifle raised, every sense on high alert. Inside, the lights were still on from earlier. 3 shapes moved in the shadows near the back corner. Tall shapes. Not human shapes. Jake stepped through the doorway. Get away from that. His voice came out hard and commanding, nothing like the quiet farmer he'd become. The 3 figures turned. They were Krivithi, lizard-like aliens with dull green scales and cold, calculating eyes. Jake recognized them instantly. Everyone on the frontier knew about the Krivithi. They were smugglers, thieves, the kind who'd sell their own mothers if the price was right. They wore mismatched armor and carried weapons that had seen too much use. The biggest one stepped forward. His mouth pulled back, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Human," he said, the word dripping with contempt. "This doesn't concern you. Walk away while you still can." "This is my barn," Jake said, his finger resting on the trigger. "Everything in it concerns me. Now get out." "Or what?" The Krivithi laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You'll shoot us? 1 human against 3 of us? You're either brave or stupid." Jake didn't lower his weapon. His eyes flicked past them to the corner. That's when he saw what they were after. A broken shipping crate, its lid torn off. And inside, huddled together, were 2 tiny creatures. White scales. Wings folded tight against their bodies. Baby dragons. Not just any dragons. Drakiri. Jake had seen them in news feeds and documentaries. The Drakiri were one of the galaxy's protected species. Intelligent. Ancient. Respected. These babies couldn't be more than a few weeks old, and they were shaking with fear. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what these Krivithi were doing. Baby Drakiri, especially rare white ones, were worth millions on the black market. Collectors would pay fortunes for them. And these thieves had somehow gotten their hands on too. "Last chance, human," the lead Krivithi said. He pulled out a plasma pistol, aiming it casually at Jake's chest. "Walk away. Your kind doesn't last long out here when you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Jake's mind raced. 3 armed aliens. He was outgunned. Outmatched. But those babies in the corner were looking at him with terrified eyes, and something in his chest twisted painfully. He couldn't walk away. He wouldn't. His eyes darted around the barn. The grain silo. The loading drones. The tools scattered on the workbench. A plan formed in seconds. It was crazy. It was desperate. It was very, very human. Jake dove sideways and slammed his fist on the emergency release button. The grain silo door burst open, and 2 tons of wheat came crashing down like a golden avalanche. The Krivithi shouted in surprise as grain buried them up to their waists, getting in their eyes, their mouths, their weapons. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed the control tablet for the loading drones and punched in commands. The machines whirred to life, their mechanical arms extending. They weren't designed for combat, but Jake didn't need them to be. He needed chaos. He needed confusion. The drones buzzed forward, grabbing at the Krivithi, knocking their weapons aside. One alien roared and fired wildly. The plasma bolt went wide but caught Jake's shoulder, burning through his jacket. Pain exploded across his arm like liquid fire. He bit down on a scream and fired back, his shot forcing the Krivithi toward the door. "You'll regret this," the leader shouted, spitting out wheat. "We'll be back. We'll bring an army." Jake fired again and the three aliens scrambled out of the barn, cursing in their language. He heard their ship's engines roar to life. Lights flashed across the fields and then they were gone, disappearing into the night sky. Jake slumped against the barn wall, his legs shaking. His shoulder felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against it. His heart hammered in his chest. But the barn was quiet now. The screeching had stopped. He set down his rifle carefully and approached the crate. Two pairs of glowing amber eyes watched him from the shadows. The baby dragons were so small, no bigger than the cats he'd kept back on Earth. Their white scales caught the light, shimmering like pearls. They pressed against each other, trembling. "Hey," Jake said softly, crouching down slowly. "It's okay. They're gone now. I won't hurt you." The larger baby made a tiny sound, a chirp, almost. It broke Jake's heart. They were so scared, so vulnerable. He knew what he should do. The rules were clear. Contact the authorities. Hand them over to the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency. Let the professionals handle it. But Jake also knew the reality. The nearest GWPA station was months away. By the time help arrived, those Krivithi would be back with reinforcements. These babies wouldn't survive that long. He looked at them. They looked back at him with those impossibly trusting eyes. "All right," Jake said quietly, making a choice that would change his life forever. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He reached into the crate carefully. The babies were warm, their scales smooth under his fingers. They didn't fight. They were too tired, too scared. Jake lifted them gently and held them against his chest. They weighed almost nothing. His shoulder throbbed as he carried them back to his cabin. Each step hurt. But he didn't stop. Behind him, the barn door creaked in the wind. Somewhere out there in the darkness, he knew the Krivithi were planning their return. But right now that didn't matter. Right now, two tiny lives depended on him. And Jake Bennett had already lost one family. He wasn't about to lose another. The first week with the baby dragons nearly killed Jake. Not from danger but from sheer exhaustion and worry. Keeping two alien babies alive turned out to be harder than anything he'd done before, including terraforming crops on a planet that didn't want them to grow. The hatchlings needed heat. Constant, intense heat. Jake's cabin had never been built for that. He spent 2 days ripping apart his spare room, the one he'd been using for storage, turning it into something that might work as a nest. He dragged in thermal generators, the big industrial ones he normally saved for preserving crops through Verdania 7's brutal winters. The room became a sauna. Sweat poured down Jake's face every time he went in there, but the baby stopped shivering, so he kept the generators running. Food was worse. What did baby dragons eat? Jake had no clue. He spent hours hunched over his computer terminal, eyes burning from staring at the screen, searching through every galactic database he could access. Most of the information about Drakiri was restricted or incomplete. He found fragments, mentions of protein requirements, temperature preferences, growth rates. Nothing concrete. Nothing helpful. He started experimenting. Synthetic protein powder mixed with water. The hatchlings wouldn't touch it. He tried native Verdanian plants, grinding them into paste. They sniffed it and turned away. He combined them, adjusted ratios, added minerals. Failure after failure. By the third day Jake was panicking. The babies were getting weaker. Their scales had lost some of their shine. Then, finally he found something that worked. A mix of synthetic protein, crushed harvest berries from his south field, and a mineral supplement designed for livestock. It looked disgusting, gray-green slop that smelled faintly sweet. But when he offered it to the larger baby, the little dragon actually ate it. Jake named them that night. The bigger one, bold and curious, became Max. The smaller one, gentler and more careful, became Lily. He knew he probably shouldn't name them. Getting attached was dangerous. But looking at their tiny faces, watching them sleep curled together in their nest, Jake couldn't help it. "Come on, Max, eat," he said the next morning, holding out a bowl of the mixture. Max was being stubborn, turning his head away. "I know it looks terrible. Trust me, I wouldn't eat it either. But it's good for you. Promise?" Max's amber eyes studied Jake for a long moment. Then, slowly, he dipped his snout into the bowl and took a bite. Lily watched her brother, then immediately did the same. Within seconds, both bowls were empty. "There we go," Jake breathed, relief washing over him so strongly his hands shook. "Good kids." The word hung in the air. Kids. Jake's chest tightened. He hadn't called anyone that in 3 years. Not since the accident. Not since he'd lost everyone who'd ever called him dad. He pushed the memory down, forcing himself to focus on the present. These weren't his kids. They were just babies he was keeping safe until proper help arrived. But they didn't act temporary. Within days, Max and Lily followed Jake everywhere. When he worked on his computer, they curled up under his desk, their warm bodies pressed against his feet. When he left a room, they chirped anxiously until he came back. When he sat down, they tried to climb into his lap, their tiny claws catching on his pants. They were getting stronger. Their scales grew brighter, shimmering white with hints of silver in certain light. Their movements became more coordinated. Max started trying to flap his wings, even though he was way too small to fly. He'd hop off the couch, wings beating frantically, and land in a heap on the floor. Then he'd chirp proudly like he'd accomplished something amazing. Lily was more cautious, but she copied everything her brother did, usually with better results. Word spread through the small colony. Humans loved to gossip, even on frontier worlds. Maybe especially on frontier worlds where entertainment was scarce. Beth Morrison showed up one afternoon without warning. She ran the settlement supply depot and considered herself everyone's unofficial keeper. "Jake," she said, standing in his doorway with her arms crossed. "We need to talk about those dragons." Jake let her in. Lily was attempting to climb onto the couch, her small claws scrabbling at the fabric. Beth watched with a mix of concern and something that might have been wonder. "You can't keep them," Beth said flatly. "Jake, they're Drakiri. Do you understand what that means? They're not animals. They're sentient beings. They have rights, cultures, governments. And when they grow up, they'll be bigger than your cabin." "I know what they are," Jake replied, keeping his voice calm. "I'm not trying to keep them forever, Beth. I sent an emergency signal to the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency 2 days after I found them. I'm just keeping them alive until help arrives. That could be months." "I know. And those thieves, the Krivithi, they're not going to just forget about 2 albino Drakiri babies worth millions of credits." Jake met her eyes. "I know that too. So what happens when they come back?" Beth asked. "You think you can fight them off again? You barely survived the first time." Jake glanced at his shoulder, which still ached where the plasma bolt had grazed him. "Then I'll fight them off again," he said simply. "What else am I supposed to do? Hand over 2 babies to criminals?" Beth sighed, running a hand through her hair. She looked at Lily, who had successfully conquered the couch and was now chirping proudly. "You're going to get yourself killed over this." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But at least I'll die doing something that matters." After Beth left, Jake sat on the couch. Lily immediately climbed into his lap. Max followed, struggling to fit beside his sister. They were already getting too big for this, but Jake made room. Their warmth seeped through his shirt. Their scales were smooth under his fingers. "You two are going to be a lot of trouble, aren't you?" Jake murmured. Max chirped in response. It almost sounded like agreement. Jake smiled despite himself. For the first time in 3 years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. 3 weeks went by without a word from anyone. No Krivithi ships in the sky. No response from the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency. Just Jake and the 2 hatchlings, falling into patterns that felt more and more like family with each passing day. It scared him how natural it had become. Max and Lily weren't tiny anymore. They'd grown fast, almost too fast. They were the size of large dogs now, their bodies filling out, their movements becoming graceful and purposeful. Their wings had strengthened enough for short flights. Well, gliding hops really. They couldn't stay airborne long, but watching them leap from the barn roof and glide across the yard made Jake's heart swell with pride he didn't quite understand. They'd started helping with the farm work. Lily had sharp eyes and could spot problems from the air that Jake would have missed walking the fields. Damaged crops, broken irrigation lines, weak spots in the fencing. She'd circle above, chirping loudly until Jake came to see what she'd found. Max had figured out how to carry tools in his claws. He couldn't manage the heavy stuff yet, but he'd bring Jake wrenches, screwdrivers, smaller equipment. It was clumsy and inefficient, but Jake let him do it anyway. The little dragon's face lit up every time Jake thanked him. Jake talked to them constantly. All day, every day. He told them about the farm, about how to fix a broken water pump, about which crops needed what kind of soil. He talked about Earth, about the farm he'd left behind, about the ocean he used to visit as a kid. He talked about his old life, carefully dancing around the painful parts, the memories that still cut too deep. He knew Drakiri were intelligent, sentient. The databases made that clear. But he didn't really expect them to understand much of what he said. They were babies after all. He talked mostly because the silence had become unbearable. 3 years alone had taught him that hearing his own voice was better than hearing nothing at all. One evening, after spending all day repairing the barn's damaged roof, Jake was exhausted. His muscles ached. His hands were covered in scrapes and burns from the welding torch. But he still had one more job to do, tucking in Max and Lily. It had become a ritual, something he looked forward to despite his tiredness. He'd go to their nest room, check their scales carefully for any scratches or problems, make sure their water bowl was full and fresh, adjust the thermal generators if needed. Then he'd dim the lights and let them settle in for sleep. "All right, you too," Jake said, kneeling beside the nest. Lily's wing was bent at an odd angle. He smoothed it down gently, making sure the feathers lay flat. "Sleep tight. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. We've got to reinforce the south fence before the storm season hits." Lily looked up at him. Those luminous amber eyes caught the dim light, almost glowing. Her mouth opened and she made a sound Jake had never heard before. It wasn't the chirping she did when she was happy. It wasn't the screeching from when she was scared. It was something new. Something that sounded like a word. Dad. Time stopped. Jake's hand froze on her wing. The world seemed to tilt sideways. He stared at her, unable to breathe, unable to think. That sound. That word. It couldn't be. He must have misheard. "What did you?" Jake started, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad," Lily said again. Clearer this time. Deliberate. Her eyes never left his face. Max's head shot up from where he'd been dozing. His eyes went wide. He looked at his sister, then at Jake, then back at his sister. And then, with excitement practically vibrating through his whole body, he said it too. "Dad." Jake sat down hard on the floor. His legs just gave out. His chest felt like someone had wrapped steel bands around it. His eyes burned with tears he'd been holding back for 3 years. That word. That one simple word carried the weight of everything he'd lost. Memories crashed over him like waves. A little girl's voice calling from another room. Tiny hands grabbing his fingers. A child riding on his shoulders through apple trees, laughing at the sky. That last morning, her sleepy smile at breakfast, her casual goodbye that he'd never known would be the last thing she'd ever say to him. "Hey," Jake managed to say, his voice breaking. "Hey, it's okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. These two alien creatures, these beautiful impossible beings he'd rescued from thieves, were calling him Dad. And the terrifying, wonderful truth was that he wanted them to. He wanted it so badly it hurt worse than the plasma burn on his shoulder. "I'm not," Jake tried to explain, to tell them he wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy. "I don't know how to do this. I failed once before. I can't lose anyone else. I can't." The words choked off. He couldn't finish. Couldn't say it out loud. Lily moved first. She crawled forward, her body warm and solid, and pressed her snout gently against his hand. The gesture was so tender, so full of trust, that Jake's heart cracked wide open. Max joined her immediately, pushing his head under Jake's other hand. Both hatchlings radiated warmth and absolute trust. Jake pulled them close, wrapping his arms around them as much as he could. They were getting too big for this, but he didn't care. He buried his face against Lily's scales and let the tears come. 3 years of grief and loneliness poured out in racking sobs he couldn't control. "Okay," Jake whispered when he could finally speak again. "Okay, I'll try. I promise I'll try to be what you need. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Max chirped softly and snuggled closer. Lily's wing wrapped around Jake's shoulder like a hug. In that moment, in that warm nest room on a lonely frontier world, Jake Bennett became a father again. And this time he swore to himself he wouldn't fail. You know what's worse than getting robbed once? Getting robbed twice by the same people. And that's exactly what happened next. About 2 weeks after the first break-in, the family was just starting to feel safe again. They had replaced the broken window, cleaned up the mess, and slowly begun to relax in their own home. The kids were sleeping better at night. Mom had stopped jumping at every little sound. Life was getting back to normal. But these criminals weren't done yet. Late one evening around midnight, the house was completely quiet. Everyone was fast asleep, exhausted from a long day. The father had just finished a double shift at work. The mother had spent hours cleaning and cooking. The children were dreaming peacefully in their beds. That's when the thieves came back. This time they were even bolder than before. They knew the layout of the house now. They remembered where everything was located. They had already seen what valuables were inside. And apparently they wanted more. The sound started small. A gentle scraping noise at the back door. Then a soft clicking sound like someone trying to pick a lock. The family dog started growling low in his throat, sensing something wasn't right. But everyone was sleeping too deeply to notice. The thieves managed to get the back door open without making too much noise. They had come prepared this time with better tools and a solid plan. They moved through the kitchen like shadows, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But here's where things got different. The father woke up. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was luck, but something pulled him out of sleep. He heard a faint sound downstairs, something that didn't belong. His heart started racing immediately. Not again, he thought. Please, not again. He quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake his wife. His hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. Should he call the police first or check what's happening? Every second felt like an hour. His mind was racing with thoughts about his family's safety. He slowly opened the bedroom door and looked down the hallway. That's when he saw it. A faint glow of light moving around downstairs. Someone was definitely in the house. His first thought was his children. He had to protect them. He quickly but quietly moved to their rooms, checking on each one. They were all still asleep, completely unaware of the danger lurking below. He gently closed their doors, creating at least one more barrier between them and the intruders. Then he did something incredibly brave. Instead of hiding or waiting for help, he made a decision. He grabbed a baseball bat from the hallway closet, took a deep breath and started walking toward the stairs. His whole body was trembling, but he kept moving forward. Meanwhile, downstairs, the thieves were getting comfortable. They thought they had all the time in the world. They were casually looking through drawers, checking cabinets and stuffing items into their bags. They were even talking to each other in low whispers, completely confident that nobody would catch them. The father reached the top of the stairs. He could see their shadows moving in the living room. His phone was in his pocket, but he was too scared to pull it out and call for help. What if the light from the screen gave him away? What if they came upstairs before the police could arrive? He stood there frozen, trying to figure out what to do next. Every option seemed dangerous. If he confronted them, they might attack him. If he did nothing, they might come upstairs and find his family. If he made noise, he might wake everyone up and cause panic. His heart was pounding so loud he thought the thieves might actually hear it. Then something unexpected happened. The family dog, who had been quiet until now, suddenly started barking like crazy. The sound exploded through the quiet house like an alarm. The dog had finally had enough of these strangers in his territory. The thieves panicked immediately. They hadn't expected this. They grabbed whatever they could carry and rushed toward the back door. The father heard them running, heard the door slam open, heard their footsteps disappearing into the night. But the damage was done. The family was awake now, scared and confused. The children were crying. The mother was calling the police. And once again, their home had been violated by strangers who didn't care about the fear and trauma they were causing. This second break-in hurt even worse than the first one because now the family realized something terrible. Their home wasn't safe anymore, and maybe it never would be again. When the young human first stepped onto the Drakiri homeworld, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Everything about this place seemed impossible, like something straight out of a fantasy story that couldn't possibly exist in real life. The planet they called Pyralis was absolutely breathtaking. The sky wasn't blue like Earth's sky. Instead, it glowed with this warm golden color, like a permanent sunset that stretched across the entire horizon. The air felt different too, thicker somehow, and it carried strange scents he had never smelled before. Sweet and spicy at the same time, like cinnamon mixed with flowers he couldn't name. But the real shock came when he saw the cities. Back on Earth, buildings were made of concrete, steel, and glass. Pretty ordinary stuff. Here on Pyralis, the architecture was beyond anything humans had ever created. Massive towers rose into that golden sky, but they weren't made of normal materials. These structures seemed to be carved from giant crystals that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 different colors. Blues, purples, greens, and reds danced across the surfaces of every building. Between the crystal towers stood structures made of polished stone that looked almost alive. The stone had veins running through it that actually glowed with a soft light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The young man walked through the streets in complete awe, trying to take everything in. His escort, a stern Drakiri warrior who hadn't said much during the journey, led him deeper into the city. Every step brought new wonders and new fears. The streets were filled with Drakiri citizens going about their daily lives. That's when he realized just how diverse these dragon-like beings really were. He had only seen a handful of them before, but now he was surrounded by thousands. Some Drakiri had scales that shimmered like emeralds in sunlight. Others were deep crimson red, the color of blood and fire. There were Drakiri with midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light, and others with scales so white they almost hurt to look at. Some had patterns, stripes and spots mixing different colors together. A few even had scales that seemed to shift colors as they moved, like oil on water. They came in different sizes too. Some were barely taller than him, while others towered overhead, easily 3 or 4 times his height. The larger ones had to be careful walking through the streets, making sure not to accidentally knock into the smaller citizens. And they all stopped to stare at him. The human felt incredibly small and out of place. He was the only one of his kind here, probably the only human on the entire planet. Thousands of reptilian eyes followed his every move. Some looked curious, others looked suspicious, and a few looked downright hostile. He could hear them whispering to each other in their language, words he couldn't understand but could guess the meaning of. Who is this creature? Why is he here? What has he done? His escort kept moving forward, not caring about the attention they were attracting. The warrior's claws clicked against the crystal pathways with each step, a steady rhythm that was somehow both calming and ominous. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached their destination. The conclave hall stood before them, and the young man's breath caught in his throat. This building made all the others look small by comparison. It was absolutely massive, larger than any stadium or cathedral he had ever seen on Earth. The structure was ancient, you could feel it just by looking at it. The stones were weathered by countless centuries, covered in carvings and symbols that told stories from long before humans ever left their own planet. The entrance was a pair of enormous doors, each one easily 50 feet tall. They were made of some dark metal that reflected no light, making them look like doorways into absolute darkness. Strange symbols glowed along the edges, pulsing with that same living light he had seen in the stones throughout the city. Guards stood on either side of the entrance. These weren't ordinary Drakiri citizens. These were warriors, massive and battle-scarred, wearing armor that looked like it had seen countless fights. They carried weapons that seemed both ancient and advanced at the same time. Spears with crystal tips that hummed with energy. Swords with blades that shimmered like they were made of contained lightning. The guards crossed their weapons as the young man approached, blocking the entrance. His escort spoke to them in the Drakiri language, his voice firm and authoritative. Whatever he said, it worked. The guards slowly raised their weapons and stepped aside. The massive doors began to open with a deep grinding sound that echoed across the plaza. As they swung inward, a wave of cooler air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of age and power. The young human could see into the hall now. Inside, it was dim except for shafts of golden light that came through openings in the ceiling high above. The space was enormous, like a cathedral, but instead of pews there were elevated platforms arranged in a circle. And on those platforms sat the members of the conclave. Even from a distance he could see them. Dozens of ancient Drakiri, some of the oldest and most powerful beings in their civilization. Their scales were duller than the younger ones outside, faded by time, but their eyes burned with intelligence and authority that made him want to turn and run. His escort nudged him forward. There was no going back now. As he stepped across the threshold into the conclave hall, the young man realized something that made his stomach drop. This wasn't just some meeting or hearing. This was a judgment. His judgment. And these ancient beings would decide his fate, along with the fate of countless others who depended on the decision made here today. The doors closed behind him with a boom that sounded like thunder, sealing him inside with the most powerful beings in the Drakiri civilization. Whatever happened next would change everything. Retry.